aljazeera.net.
From local traders to international finance, it's commerce that makes the world go round. For global companies and developing markets, communication is the currency, and information is the most valuable commodity. Counting the cost at this time on Al Jazeera.
Opposition leaders hold talks with the Mubarak government, but with protesters refusing to leave Tahrir Square, have Mubarak's concessions done anything to accelerate a change and bring about the orderly transition of power Western governments talk about?
Egyptian people want freedom.
An Al Jazeera news special.
This is Al Jazeera.
Welcome to the News Hour live from Doha. I'm Darine Abu Gaida from Al Jazeera News Centers here, plus Washington, D.C. These are the top stories. Demonstrators remain defiant. Now worker walkouts contribute to the wave of discontent in Egypt. Plus, the nation's military is increasingly under the spotlight as speculation grows over when and how it will intervene. Put him on trial now. Italian prosecutors call for immediate action against Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi.
And I'm Rosalind Jordan in Washington. The top story from the Americas: the U.S. man held over the killing of 2 Pakistanis and why his case has triggered a diplomatic spat between the two countries. And as President Obama gets ready to send his budget to Congress, the U.S. top banker says the country's current spending is not sustainable.
It's 1 a.m. in Egypt. Protesters there remain out on the streets for the 17th day, but the fact that workers across the country are on strike may be a more worrying development for the government. Behind the scenes, negotiations are underway between a committee of wise men and the government to agree on a transition. Emike Amulu has the details.
Gamal, tell your father the Egyptian people don't like him. Words from a young protester who's helping to keep spirits up among anti-Mubarak crowds in Alexandria. Such scenes are now repeated daily in Egypt's second largest city. Like demonstrators in Cairo, these crowds are holding their ground. On Wednesday, their cause got an added boost. The Egyptian telecommunications building in downtown Cairo. About 200 workers demanding better pay and benefits. Thousands more across Egypt were holding similar strikes. Some say it's also in solidarity with those who want President Mubarak out.
Al-Mahal Al-Kubra is considered to be a pivotal city for a change in Egypt. Our company is suffering losses, and it is also manipulated by a group of corrupt management. Meanwhile, we also support our fellow demonstrators in Tahrir Square for the change of the regime.
3 independent trade unions joined the day of mass action, also disrupting services in Suez and Port Said. This is a new dimension to the uprising. To lead a union in Egypt, you generally need government approval. The fact that these bodies now appear to be mobilizing against the state doesn't bode well. Right now, neither side in the crisis is wavering. Earlier on Wednesday, a group of prominent figures who call themselves the Wise Men met with Vice President Omar Suleiman to discuss a possible transfer of power, and like others before, didn't get very far.
The official position, be it from the Vice President or the Prime Minister's position, is that the President is going to remain in office until September, and that he continues to practice his authorities and that he is responsible for putting Egypt on democratic transition.
Not what people living in tent cities in Cairo and Alexandria want to hear. Emiko Molu, Al Jazeera.
While Liberation Square remains the focal point of protests in Cairo, some pro-democracy demonstrators gathered in front of the country's parliament on Wednesday, and Jackie Rowland was there.
The demonstrations are moving into a new phase. As you can see, the protesters are now venturing beyond Tahrir Square. Here they've come to the Parliament building, one of the symbols of power in President Mubarak's Egypt. There's a feeling that the politicians aren't listening to their message, so they've decided to bring the message to the politicians. The Parliament is packed full of members of President Mubarak's ruling National Democratic Party. The last elections were held in November and there were numerous complaints of electoral fraud. These people want the elections to be held again so that they can have a parliament that truly represents the people's wishes.
We are trying to move the demonstration to a new frontier. Now in Tahrir Square, they have already occupied Tahrir Square. Nobody can get them out from Tahrir Square. There is two ways to get them out from Tahrir Square. Either it's by listening to what they demands, or it's going to be a bloodbath.
The demonstration, as you can see, is quite well humoured, but the army isn't taking any risks. They're here in considerable numbers to make sure that nothing gets out of hand. But as you can see, they're not in any way trying to stop the demonstrators from bringing their messages to the Parliament. Jackie Rowland, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
Elsewhere in the country, 4 protesters died and around 100 people were injured in clashes with police in the western province of New Valley. Anti-Mubarak demonstrations started there on Monday night. Several people were taken to hospital. Reports say they were they're the first serious clashes in the region since the Day of Rage rallies, and that was on the 28th of January. Well, the role of the country's armed forces has been in the spotlight ever since protests in Egypt began late last month. The military has, by and large, stood on the sidelines as protests spread across the country. But will it continue to do so in the future? Well, the Vice President, Omar Suleiman, has warned of a possible coup by the army if protests continue indefinitely. Soldiers out on the streets of Egypt were welcomed by protesters early on, and some suggested it could convince some of them to go home. Generals did call on the demonstrators to end their agitation, but that didn't happen. Others say the army won't go against one of its own. The president, Hosni Mubarak, is of course a decorated military man, and troops stood by while pro and anti-Mubarak protesters clashed in central Cairo last week. Let's get some perspective on the military and more, and speak to Tariq Masoud. He's an assistant professor of public policy at Harvard University and joins us live from Boston. Thank you for your time on Al Jazeera. Do you think that the army would step in as the foreign minister in Egypt is warning?
It's a very surprising warning by the foreign minister, and of course it's very difficult to predict precisely what the army will do. I think what we have seen so far is that the army hasn't been standing by, but rather has been standing by Mubarak. The neutrality shown by the military towards the protesters as they were being attacked by the quote-unquote pro-Mubarak protesters, I think reveals very clearly that this military has a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and that for the time being they've calculated is a Hosni Mubarak presidency.
So what you're saying is that the military at this point is listening and will continue to listen to the regime, the Mubarak regime?
Absolutely, and I would also say that those who threaten a military coup have to understand that, the people aren't going to buy that as a change. In other words, the military currently runs Egypt. I mean, Mubarak obviously is the face of that and had managed to aggrandize and enrich himself. But fundamentally, the nature of this regime wouldn't change if there were a military coup. And so the question is, how does this cause the protesters to think that there's anything different at all? I don't understand. Well,
today, Mr. Masoud, we saw thousands of workers go on strike right across Egypt, and there are reports that there's more to come tomorrow and the rest of the week. But it just seems like the government is digging its heels in at this point, and so are the protesters.
Well, I think what's really remarkable about this is that the protesters do not seem to be losing steam. They seem to be gaining steam. And everybody's prediction, including mine, was that eventually there would be a kind of fatigue setting in, and that the protesters and Egyptians in generally would want to go back to a regular life, especially since Mubarak had made some significant concessions in terms of agreeing not to stand again and agreeing to a process of a constitutional reform. But I think what we're seeing now is that Egyptian people are not buying it, and that the protests are not losing their force. And so I think it's going to be very hard for the Mubarak regime to continue to ignore them.
Okay, so what are the options right now as we stand? What are the options for real political change in the country? Essentially, we're at a standstill. Mubarak's not going anywhere. The protesters not going anywhere. And no one has the power to change the constitution unless given the go-ahead by Mubarak. So what are the options now?
So that's a great question. So first of all, if the protesters continue protesting and the size of the protests increases, I don't think that we could say that Mubarak isn't leaving. It may very well be that the military could calculate that we need to get Mubarak out, and then the question is, would the protests stop or would they continue? But that's one path that we could observe. You're right that there's another path, and your reporter mentioned the wise, the committee of the wise men, or just the wise. And these people are basically trying to advocate for a path of reform that uses the existing constitution. And as you correctly noted, that President Mubarak would have to remain in place to initiate some of those reforms, because only an elected president can do that. And so that's one other path. The question is, you have to believe that Mubarak would do that, and he would negotiate in good faith, and that he wouldn't just use this, and the military wouldn't just use this as an opportunity to consolidate its hold and drag things out. The one argument that I've heard made, and that I believe is actually quite persuasive, is that what the opposition should be calling for right now are parliamentary elections to be conducted under international auspices and with significant oversight by domestic judges, and with some changes to the rules governing how you validate people's votes. So instead of using the corrupt voter rolls, you would use maybe their ID cards. But I think that might offer a way to move the protests, to institutionalize the protests, and give the protesters some power in Parliament from which they could dictate the pace of reform.
All right. Tarek Masoud, thank you very much for joining us there live from Boston.
Thanks.
Well, we'll have plenty more ahead on Egypt's dilemma in this Al Jazeera News Hour, including critical comments from the U.S. spark an angry reaction from President Hosni Mubarak's foreign minister. Plus, the family who remain dedicated to the demonstrations despite their loss during the country's Day of Rage. And neighboring Gaza feels the knock-on effect of the uprising as fuel supplies continue to dwindle.